I've been thinking recently about a question that I don't think has a particularly straightforward answer. When do you actually become good at something? Because we tend to talk about learning as though there is a point where we cross some invisible line. At first, we're a beginner. Then we learn, we practice, we get better. And eventually, somehow, we're supposed to arrive at this place where we know what we're doing. We're competent, we're experienced. Maybe we're even considered an expert. But the longer I've been doing this work, the less convinced I am that development actually works that way. I've been working with people for a long time now. I've worked across community services, alcohol and other drugs, youth and family services, health, education, and private practice. I've taught, I've trained practitioners, I've supervised practitioners, and I've worked with clients. And of course, I've been a student myself many times. And one of the things that I've noticed is that the more capable you become, the more aware you often become of just how much more there is to learn. Not necessarily because you're lacking something. I think it's because your capacity to see changes. When you're first learning something, you're often concentrating on getting it right. You're trying to remember the steps. You're thinking about what comes next. You're checking yourself. Am I doing this properly? Did I miss something? What am I supposed to say now? And that's completely appropriate. That's part of beginning. And we all begin somewhere. Nobody starts with experience. Nobody starts with mastery for sure. And nobody starts already knowing how to navigate every situation they're going to encounter. At some point, every person we now regard as highly capable did something for the very first time. And then something interesting starts to happen. You do it again and again. You have experiences you couldn't possibly have had while you were learning it theoretically. Something doesn't go according to plan. Someone responds in a way that you didn't expect. You make a different decision that works beautifully. You make another one that, looking back, you probably wouldn't make now. You begin noticing things that you simply couldn't notice at the beginning because you were concentrating on everything else. And gradually, you're not thinking so much about the steps anymore. You're thinking about the person or the situation or what is actually happening in front of you. And that's a very different kind of capability. And I see this with students all the time. At the beginning of training, people quite understandably want to know the right way to do something. They want the script, they want the steps. They want to know exactly what happens if the other person says this or does that. And I understand why. When something is unfamiliar, structure gives us somewhere to stand. But eventually, if you continue developing, you begin to understand why the structure is there. And then you start recognizing when something needs to be adapted. You begin to hear things differently. You notice more. You ask different questions. You don't necessarily need to consciously think about everything that you once had to consciously remember. And that's when experience starts changing the way you use what you've learned. But even then, I don't think we've arrived, because there's another interesting thing that happens as you become more experienced. You become comfortable, and comfort is useful. We need enough familiarity to be able to function without consciously thinking about every tiny thing that we're doing. But comfort can also make us stop questioning ourselves. We can start thinking, I've done this hundreds of times. I know how this works. I know what I'm looking at. And sometimes we do. But sometimes the moment we decide we already know is the moment that we stop noticing what's different this time. That's why I don't particularly like thinking about mastery or expertise as a destination. Not because mastery isn't valuable, and certainly not because expertise doesn't exist. It does. But if we treat either of them as a place where we finally arrived, I think we risk losing something really important. And that's curiosity, the willingness to keep asking. What am I not seeing yet? What could I do better? What has changed? What do I understand now that I didn't understand 5 years ago? And perhaps even, what do I believe now that I might think differently about 5 years from now? I've certainly changed the way that I think about things over the course of my career. There are things that I teach differently now, things that I understand differently, things I place much greater importance on than I once did. There are things that I've refined because experience showed me there was a better way. And there are probably things that I'm doing now that I'll refine again in another 5 or 10 years. I actually hope there are, because the alternative would mean that I'd stopped developing. And I don't want that. I don't want my students to stop developing either. I don't want someone to finish a certification and think, right, that's it, I know this now. I want them to leave capable of doing the work they've been trained to do, absolutely. But I also want them to recognise that certification is one point in a much longer professional journey. You begin, you have experiences, you facilitate, you reflect on what happened, you refine, and if you continue long enough, your relationship with what you know changes again. Maybe you begin mentoring someone else. Maybe you supervise. Maybe you lead. Maybe you teach. And teaching does something quite interesting to your own capability, because having to explain something to somebody else exposes what you understand deeply and what you've simply learned to do. A student asks you a question that you've never considered. Someone doesn't understand your explanation. The example that you've always used doesn't land. And suddenly you have to look at something that you thought you knew from a completely different direction. And I've experienced that many times as a trainer. Someone asks a question and I think, that's a really good question. And sometimes the answer is immediately obvious to me. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes the question itself makes me reconsider how I'm teaching something. That's development too. So is supervision. So is collaboration. So is having another practitioner see something differently from the way that you see it. So is being willing to say, I don't know, and then finding out. I think that's one of the things that we sometimes misunderstand about capability. We imagine that becoming more capable means becoming increasingly certain, and I'm not sure that it does. In some ways, I think greater capability gives us a better understanding of where certainty is justified and where it isn't. You know more, you can do more, you have more experience to draw upon. But hopefully, you also have a better appreciation of complexity. You know where your limits are, you know when you need another perspective, and you know that the fact that you've done something successfully many times before doesn't mean you have nothing left to learn from doing it again. And then, for some people, something else happens. They start contributing. They don't simply use what they've been taught. They add to it. Maybe they find a better way of explaining something. Maybe they adapt something for a particular population. Maybe they identify a gap. Or maybe they develop a whole new approach. Maybe their contribution is through teaching, or supervision, or research, or leadership, or simply through the quality of the work they do with the people who trust them. Contribution doesn't have to mean creating something enormous or becoming publicly recognised for it. Sometimes contribution is much quieter than that, but it grows out of everything that came before it. You couldn't contribute from the same place before you'd begun. You couldn't refine something that you hadn't experienced. You couldn't develop judgment without having decisions to make. And you couldn't have those experiences without, at some point, being willing to be new at something. That's why I keep coming back to this idea that capability is a lifelong journey. Not because we're never good enough. I think that's an important distinction. This isn't about constantly chasing the next qualification because you may believe that somehow you're inadequate without it. And it isn't about endlessly learning without ever allowing yourself to acknowledge what you've already become capable of. We should recognize our development. We should acknowledge experience. We should be able to say, I'm good at this. But perhaps we can say that without adding, and therefore there's nothing more for me to learn. Those are very different statements. Maybe capability is less about arriving somewhere and more about remaining engaged with our own development. Sometimes that means beginning. Sometimes it means practicing. Sometimes it means having enough confidence to actually use what we've learned. Sometimes it means reflecting on years of experience and deciding that something needs to change. And sometimes it means teaching what we know. Sometimes it means contributing something that wasn't there before. The journey changes. The questions change. What we're capable of changes. And perhaps that's the point. Because I don't think the most interesting question is, when will I finally know enough? I think a much more interesting question is, given everything I've learned, experienced and become capable of so far, where could I go from here? And I hope that's a question none of us ever completely finishes answering.